to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and as usual, I'm joined by my co-hosts Lee Johnson and Devanya Havis, and tonight we have a special guest for our adults-only, not safe for work episode on The Fucked. But before we get into the conversation, as usual, we need some drink orders, and I would like to know whether you're ranting or raving. Devanya, let me start with you.
I am going to have another Amber Haze this evening because it seems like a hazy kind of evening. And tonight, I'm raving about Roy Ayers. I loved his music. I still love his music. He had a very humorous hit song, since we're in adults only, that was called Poo Poo La La. On your poo poo la la.
Oh, wow.
On your poo poo la la.
Nice.
If you get a chance, I think it will make you roll around laughing, but I want to give a shout out to Roy Ayers.
Who's that sitting next to you?
Oh, sitting next to me, this guy? This guy is Carlos Amador, professor of Spanish at University at Buffalo SUNY. He works on 20th and 21st century Latin American literature, film, and cultural production. What's up, Carlos?
What's up, Devanya? What's up, crew? Thank you for having me here.
Welcome.
Thank you very much.
Carlos, what are you drinking? And are you ranting or raving?
I'm drinking Diet Pepsi and keep them coming. Because I don't think you want to see me under the other stuff.
Take that, Coca-Cola.
That's right. Yeah. Also like a political gesture.
Ooh.
You know, there's some less than supportable members of this current regime who happen to love Diet Coke. So I'm going to choose the Diet Pepsi for its lemony aftertaste. Well, I'm going to rave about the greatest physical actor since Jackie Chan or Buster Keaton or Charlie Chaplin. Even if you want to talk about Anne Margaret, it's Tom Cruise. I actually have a whole theory on why Tom Cruise may be the best actor of the 20th and 21st century. I don't think the camera loves anybody's face like him. In terms of just like what the camera does to his face, if you watch those Mission Impossible movies, maybe it's just me, like I'm rapt. I think he's like some sort of combination between Jacques-Louis David Odalisque and like one of those Hieronymus Bosch hell paintings, right? Like his face is this contorted perfection of angst. And I don't think there's anybody who runs better on film. I've rewound full minutes of him in Mission Impossible just to be like, I could watch this guy run forever.
Oh, wow.
Forever. I don't know what the dynamics are psychically or affectively, but yeah, I'm going to go on that. And I'll go hard for that one. As hard as I will for like the Buffalo Bills. Tom Cruise is the camera's favorite actor.
Nice.
Lee, what about you? What are you drinking, and are you ranting or raving?
I'm not going to have a Diet Coke or a Pepsi, but I am going to have 2 fingers of Buffalo Trace on a rock. And today I am ranting about Chesterton's fence. Basically, the core idea is that there might be a fence in this walk that you're on, and you don't know why it's there, and it may seem right to just knock it down. But whether it's a fence or laws or institutions or customs or even just seemingly arbitrary rules, they're probably there for a reason, and removing them without understanding that reason can have unintended and potentially negative consequences. This, to me, seems to be like the Elon Musk mode of operating right now. And I would just like to introduce you, Mr. Musk, to Mr. Chesterton. Mr. Musk, stay the fuck away from Mr. Chesterton's fences.
Good fences make good neighbors.
Don't they? All right, Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
I'm going to have a Manhattan with rye, please. Tonight, I am raving about the HBO documentary God is the Bigger Elvis. I don't know if you've seen this, but this is a short documentary about a woman named Dolores Hart, who in the late 50s and 60s was one of the hardest working actors in Hollywood. She was in an Elvis Presley film called Loving You. It was the first time Elvis kissed on screen, and he kissed Dolores Hart. Dolores Hart eventually gave up her Hollywood career and today is a Benedictine nun in cloister. They're praying 7 times a day. They're up in the middle of the night praying, and when they're not praying, they're working. And this documentary is just unbelievable about her story and how she went from kissing Elvis on screen to being a prioress at a Benedictine monastery. It's just remarkable.
I mean, of course, Elvis is also in that monastery.
She wouldn't say. She took a vow of silence.
Of course she did.
I am so looking forward to this discussion because, Devanya, I know that you are not a cusser, generally speaking, and yet we're talking tonight about the fucked. And so I'm wondering how we're going to do this, especially how you're going to do this without saying fuck.
Well, I'm just going to have to say fucked. I was sitting here prompted to think about Nietzsche's Madman, and maybe I'm feeling a little mad. Hence, I get to cuss, as they say in the South, or as I say, curse. And I kept thinking about Nietzsche's Madman, asking, what did we do when we unchained the earth from its sun? Whither is it moving now? Whither are we moving now? Away from all suns? Are we perpetually falling? And I don't know about you all, but my sensibility of perpetually falling has kind of ramped up over the last, I wanted to say few months. I feel like it's been a year, but it really hasn't. It just has that quality. And I've been talking with my buddy and interlocutor, Carlos, over there, and I know he works on an aesthetic category called the fucked. I started to ask myself, how might we make sense of a world where all the usual political categories fail, where the horizon of revolutionary possibilities seems to have been forestalled because we live in an ongoing precarity? Some of us a precarity of extreme poverty, some displacement, some political disenfranchisement, and all of these are marked by a radical kind of social immobility. When there's nothing left, what are the actionable possibilities? What do we do if we're fucked? Carlos, I know you've been working on a variety of aesthetic categories, and among them is Jodito, translated as the fucked. I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about how you use this aesthetic category and how it helps us make sense of material conditions.
One of the reasons I started working on this was there was a film, it's called Tony Manero. It's from 2007, Chilean director Pablo Larraín, who has now become more internationally famous for movies like, I don't know if anyone saw the movie Jackie, where Natalie Portman plays Jackie Onassis. Larraín directed that. And if you're a Netflix watcher, there's a movie that Larraín directed called The Count, El Conde, which is about Pinochet, Chile's military dictator from 1973 until 89. Pinochet and his family as vampires. So it's this parody comedy take on the dictatorship as this sort of sanguinary resource for reactionary politics. But this movie, Tony Manero, is, long story short, it's about a hyper-violent member of what you used to call the demi-monde, whose goal in life is to win a Saturday Night Fever dance contest, dressed as Tony Manero, John Travolta's character. And when I was teaching it, one of my students was like, "Professor, why are all the movies that you show us about people who are so fucked?" I believe at this point now the story has taken more shape, more of a tall tale, but I believe he said screwed. And it occurred to me that that dejection or abjection, however we want to frame it, was something that was recognizable in this film. That we have these categories, affects, these ways of relating to media, to art, to literature, where we grasp the concept, even if it's partially shown. Mm-hmm. There was something about this student telling me, all your movies are about people who are fucked, that I thought, there's got to be something there. There has to be something in that recognizability. So this whole project emerged out of that moment to try to understand what's it like to have a recognizable aesthetic category, one that can travel across global boundaries of cultural understanding, of connection to historical symbols, historical resources, in this contemporary post-liberal democracy frame, which I believe we can talk about this later, but I think the end of liberal democracy or the beginning of its decline starts arguably much earlier than 1973. But one of the first real blows to the decline of liberal democracy, at least in the hemisphere, is the September 11th, 1973 CIA-sponsored coup against the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende.
Yeah.
This moment of recognition and understanding that this is possible to talk about in literature and film, and moreover, possible to identify formalisms, identify these ways of mapping out our minds and our images and our words to students, to viewers with very little, or listeners with very little understanding of what's happening. So I kind of have always been interested in the aesthetic moment, the moment that we appreciate and think about things, even in extremely unpleasant situations like moments of collective disgust or contempt. These moments are really compelling to me as a thinker. I think it's always something that I've been interested in, is watching how people see their world.
Carlos, one of the hats I wear is I'm a medievalist, and so I like to make distinctions. And I'm getting a little bit uncomfortable with how messy this category of the fucked might be. And since you mentioned the abject or abjection, I was wondering if we could begin with that, because when I hear the abject and abjection, I think of someone who has been cast out, who has been thrown aside, who has been left behind. But that to me doesn't connote the same thing as someone who's fucked. I'm trying to figure out what is that extra thing that belongs to the fucked that isn't just abjection, because feminist theorists and others have been talking about abjection for a long time. Tina Chanter pops into my mind.
Mm-hmm. I just wanted to jump in to say that what I don't think we foregrounded thus far in the conversation are the material conditions. Like, being fucked is not only an affective psychological position, it's also an embodied position that is oriented to various forms of materiality and precarity.
For sure.
And I think that, for me, makes it different than the abject. And the abject has always felt very much to me like an abstract category, like the pain is over there. I'm not having to trudge through it in an unrelenting way.
Right.
Yeah.
Now you're warming the cockles of my medievalist heart.
But it's like the ship of fools, like you're stuck on the boat of folly.
I think that's the point of the fucked, is the stuckness.
Mm.
I'll confess that as someone deeply influenced by Marxism and Foucault and Lacanianism, and also analytic philosophy, right? I got a master's in philosophy and then I went into comparative literature. And one of the reasons was because I felt, there wasn't a space to play. So
in philosophy, what?
I feel like anytime I've said that, there's either a chorus of people shaking their heads going, you're right, or just this sort of incredulous stare.
I'm in the chorus. I'm in the chorus.
Okay, great. I'm glad that you, I don't feel so alone at the moment. But let me talk to Rick's point. I don't see abjection or trauma or the fucked as really different. And I'm using these three categories, these three ideas laid across horizontally on a table for a specific reason, is that I think part of what unites them all is a sense of the inescapable. There's a sense of a permanence. Perhaps there's social mobility in an artist's life, social mobility in the sense that their precarity and status in terms of how they feed themselves, how they clothe themselves, what are their discursive possibilities, whom are they speaking with, what audience. Perhaps there's a way forward from abjection, but all of these begin from a sense of, I think, inescapability. As someone who works on Marxism and considers himself Marxish, I can't see the outside to capital. My official term is Marxish because I recognize where I deviate and I'm not orthodox. But I'm going to be orthodox about the fact that I think that there's something ineluctable about talking about social situations, especially from positions of extraordinary failure or extraordinary lack of access. And here's where I can go back and talk to the material conditions. The fact that in many situations, someone being fucked begins from a status of radical loss, or the abjection begins from a status of interminable pain and alienation from the social world, gave me the force and the energy to begin to see the artists and writers I'm working with as saying something really profound about the horizon of what's possible to think. Is it possible to think politics? And this can go in very reactionary ways, and we can talk about this later. But to answer your question, Rick, I don't see them as necessarily separate so much as different facets of one interlocking gem of reality, that each of them, when you apply light to them in a certain way, could refract. But no one here gets out alive. There's the late psychoanalyst and feminist theorist Lauren Berlant has the idea of cruel optimism. One definition is that which you most desire is actually your stumbling block to the achievement of joy or enjoyment. And I see the fucked as essentially the structural version of cruel optimism, that anything that you do, no matter what you desire, is going to lead to reframing the system in particularly noxious or at least remarkable in the sense of comment. You're going to comment on something like, this is where we're at. That it began with me trying to think through some of these concepts of informality in labor, the inability to feed oneself other than by selling art on the street. And what is that precarious situation? How does that state of being unable to feed ourselves or pressured by social life tell us about what we say to ourselves about this condition, about this social reality?
As someone who considers herself a Marxist, not Marx-ish, but like a Marxist and a feminist, I really do appreciate this aesthetic notion of the fucked, which I can, honestly, on a core level, identify with. Just like a living human being working in a late capitalist society. However, I have a few questions for you.
Sure.
And none of these are meant to be aggressive, though they are 100% going to sound like they're aggressive. But a few years ago, several years ago, actually, said to some friends of mine that I was going to try to stop using the word fuck as a verb. I think that there's no way to read the verbing of fuck as anything other than a rape reference. So I'd like you first to just address that. How do you separate the fucked from obvious reference to sexual violence? If you don't want to separate the fucked from sexual violence, how do you redeem it as an important aesthetic category for our current conditions?
Wow, those are excellent questions. I think I can see, and I'm starting the second one in reverse, because I can see where you've created a kind of moral thread, and I respect that. I have a section that I've left in the writing process that I really try to work on, which is this condition of not taking that apperception of sexual violence as something to be a trifle. I think it's significant, especially as somebody who considers himself not just an ally, but radically feminist or at least anti-gender hierarchy. I don't shy away from that. I don't deny it. As a cishet male, I can't transmogrify rape into something that's a condition of my social body. So what I want to suggest is that lo jodido, trauma, abjection, the depravity of a social culture where a female presenting body is seen as a resource for sexual violence are all defined by this kind of ineluctable lack of an outside.
I don't think there aren't ways in which the aesthetic category, also it's a political, maybe even a moral category of the fucked. Like, I'm not sure that there aren't morally responsible ways to use that. So contrary to what I said before, I've made this agreement with my friends that we're not going to say fuck you or somebody got fucked or whatever, because we want to avoid, by reference, rape. I think that what you're saying is actually a more or less description of rape, cultural or economic or political or whatever. I mean, I don't think it's an inappropriate use. I would like to hear you just defend it. And I really want you to defend it because I think it's a really important category.
I certainly like to think of it as important. There's a little bit of secret context here. One of the things that I'm most interested in, and it predates this project, is I'm extremely interested in how reactionaries and fascists, hard, authoritarian conservatives, or even their more extraordinarily anti-political, apolitical writers, artists, cultural producers, philosophers, how they imagine the world. For me, one of the things that I think is so important to understand about this contemporary period of right-wing populism is that we are actually now in the end of history phase. I think Fukuyama was about 30 years too soon with his declaration. So I take your point significantly. I think what I don't want to do with rape is allow the fascist to imagine the political as the simulation of the rape of a vulnerable body. And I think I can show in a significant amount of reactionary literature, from Renaud Camus' We Will Not Be Replaced to Colombian reactionary Nicolás Gómez Dávila, there's a kind of masculinist rejection of the capacity to be a sexually vulnerable victim. I take some advantage of that in the work. Talking to you, I recognize it's an advantage that I'm going to have to foreground and I'm going to have to situate even more powerfully. But that's sort of the way in, that I was looking at people who imagined the end of politics and the end of ethics as not the end of the social, but rather the condition of possibility for the social that they live, and the point of departure for that imagination. I do a lot of work with really aggressive, authoritarian, violent figures in this chapter. I don't particularly want to cede territory to this imaginary, because then that's a distortion of vulnerability. Maybe the fucked could be a moral category if we're asserting that being fucked is the condition of vulnerability that demands action, that demands a transformation. And then what we're called upon doing is some evaluation of our political or ethical norms.
Think back to the first time you listened to Hotel Bar Sessions. Maybe you came upon an episode randomly. Maybe a friend sent it to you. Maybe you weren't even sure what you were getting into, but then, pow, you were hooked. You kept listening. You started looking forward to new episodes, and now you're part of this conversation. But here's the thing. This show only exists because people like you support it. So if you've ever laughed, argued with us out loud, or sent an episode to a friend, it's time to step up. Become a patron at patreon.com/Hotel Bar Sessions. Or, if a monthly pledge isn't your thing, visit hotelbarpodcast.com to make a one-time contribution. You've been here this long, why not pull up a chair and assist with keeping the bar open?
Carlos, I really appreciate you clarifying your meaning of fucked, even despite my protests, which, by the way, were not meant to be a baiting of you earlier. But given your apologies already, I would like to hear, maybe in just like the most straightforward, simple terms, what you mean by the fucked.
For me, the fucked is at least two things. One, it's a diagnosis and an acceptance of a kind of absolute state of there's no outside to the capitalist situation. Maybe it's the sort of effect of what would be once called consciousness raising. And the second thing is the rejection of the horizon of political possibility in anything that's prior to that moment. That almost the entire seed of the contemporary moment is toxic. Now, aesthetically, what you might do with it as a cultural producer, as a writer, as an artist, it's variable, right? You could say that things are fucked and you can take great glee in it.
So, just to be clear, because it's a little confusing, is the fucked a subject position, an aesthetic category, or is the fucked an action?
Yes.
I want to jump in and ask.
Wait. Can you let him answer that first?
I think it was.
I thought it was yes to all of them.
Yes was an answer.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So confused when I ask and I get a yes answer.
That was me trying to simulate that David Lynch meme where he says, God is gay. And I think David Letterman asks him or somebody, can you elaborate? And he says, no. I wanted to do it in the positive sense. That is it and yes.
Well done, sir. Well done.
So I'm wondering what an aesthetic category can do that philosophy can't do. Because it seems to me the leaning into an aesthetic category that might also be a political category, that might also be a way of life, that might also be a subject position, is working to do something that our existing categories can't do or can't articulate.
I don't see it like that. I don't think of categories as being antagonistic to philosophy. What I see as the aesthetic category is production of certain logics. It's a production of an approach or the analysis that comes from the philosophical approach. One of the books that inspired this, and I work on it throughout the whole of this current research project, is a book by another University of Chicago person. And it's totally serendipitous that Sian Nye and Lauren Berlant and other University of Chicago figures have become really relevant to my work. But her book was called Our Aesthetic Categories: The Zany, the Interesting, and the Cute. It's an analysis of German philosophy since Kant. How does interest appeal to us aesthetically? How does it change the way we think? Unless we define philosophy as a non-conceptual producing machine, a non-concept producing machine.
Nobody conceives of philosophy that way.
Yeah.
Yeah. Then the aesthetic category is part of the production of theory. And it also is dialectical, right? Here's where I am being Marxist. When we get to a situation of the fucked, we ask ourselves, how do we reread our material conditions? Or when we get to this idea of the crisis, 2/3 of our politics right now is going to the draconian right under the state of exception that's produced by the term crisis. And I think that's an approach. That's a way of imagining facticity and the building of categories. So I don't see philosophy as antagonistic to aesthetics. I see aesthetics as being a deeply philosophical position. And I want to think about what Walter Benjamin says in Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction. I think it's in the 3rd or 4th section. He says, when we lose the aura, what occurs is that authenticity becomes the realm of politics. And I think that shows us that if we don't want to conceive of pleasure and affect, horror and sentiment as having a role in our philosophical category, then let's just think of seeing an object, this move away from the oracular singularity of an artwork to the massively produced reiterativeness of what we buy in the art market. We're doing philosophy backwards from the material conditions. Our concepts are now revealed as being new in this mode. So that's where I see this. I don't see it as an antagonism. I see it as a companion or as a necessary consequence of philosophy to have aesthetic categories, to have ways of comprehending our manners of mapping out what we think of as the real or the conceptually important.
So I didn't mean to suggest that it's an antagonism. I think where there is failure, there is also opportunity. And it strikes me that there's something going on in this category that might be akin to what Fanon is calling upon what's been translated as the wretched of the earth, but I prefer to think about it as the damned of the earth. That seems to carry a similar kind of resonance as the category of the fucked. So I'm not arguing that it's antithetical. I just wonder how it speaks to some of the limits of philosophy. And I say that as someone who bumps up against these limits. How do I talk about the material conditions of blackness read as a kind of fungibility in the context of Western philosophical traditions? I mean, there are other resources, but what I like about the way you're using this category is that I think it is giving language or giving voice or giving sound to a place that I'm not sure has been theorized through philosophy. And that's why I'm asking, what does it do differently? What does it allow us to glimpse?
Those are really provocative questions. This is what I hope the reader will get out of my book, or at least the listener will get out of this intervention. It does a little bit of the same work that concepts like cruel optimism or the Foucauldian concept of discourse. We think of that as pretty big, but I think of the term discourse as essentially being a kind of tether point to what we are talking about in our everyday life that comes from about 6 different directions.
That's so right.
And
yes.
why I decided to do Lo Jodido was because I'm still really taken by the gesture of the abandonment of the possibility of reform, of the possibility of a future within our contemporary moment as the condition of possibility of politics. And so when you talk about fungibility, I have to say that it's that fungibility that allows us to change and challenge philosophical categories and our new ways of reading and thinking. If anything, fungibility is one of the most threatening things to our contemporary political class.
Note that, Crypto Bros. Fungibility is one of the most threatening things to our social order. But if I could just pick up on something that you just said, which I found intriguing. If we imagined the fucked as a category and it having a kind of leverage. Like, I don't remember who said this. Who was it that said, if I have a point and was it a lever and a point?
If I have a fixed point and a lever, I can move the world.
I knew that Rick would know this. Okay. Like if I had a fixed point and a lever to move the world. Right. Who was it who said that?
Archimedes, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. But if I had an Archimedean point and I was just using the fucked as a way to leverage action in the world. How do you see this leverage point? I mean, maybe that's not a direct enough question. Let me just state it more explicitly. What difference does it make to understand who the fucked is, what the fucked is, what the fucked means in order to change the world?
Wow. I am not interested in the world changers in this book. I have to say, I'm not evading that question. I will get to that question. For the purposes of the book, I'm interested in the dropouts.
The dropouts of what? What have they dropped out of?
In a kind of cheeky way, I'll answer. There are the left fucked and the right fucked. What I'm interested in is an explanation of the right fucked, jodidos reaccionarios, as not recreating politics or recreating ethics, but rather ejecting. And what is happening in that ejection from the political? How does that acceptance of everyday horror and violence and inescapability from social precarity and informality and the vagaries of underfunded mental health care across Latin America and across the world hemispherically, how do those create new imaginaries? So for me, my research is on reactionaries. I think we have the left fuck, that sense of inescapability and structural venom, structural toxicity is the condition of possibility for the brilliance of queer theory and trans theory, for the humbling aesthetic calls, the demands that Afro-pessimism, Afrofuturism, Black theory, Latinx theory, the margins call to us from the position of the fucked. That doesn't mean that the fucked can't contain optimism. It means that optimism is formed out of this kind of chromosomal goo of the fucked. So there's a lot. I think we think that our system is going to continue to reform around certain arcs. Sure, cool. Or on certain axes, cool. But don't get it twisted. We know that the soil is toxic.
But that's why I think it's interesting that you described the fucked as ejected and your philosophical project as a politics of rejection. I mean, there's a distinct difference between being ejected from something and rejecting something.
I think in the ejection, we can reject hope. Part of what I do argue in the fucked is that the figures that I look at begin from a conspicuous and centered engagement with thinking through ejection and rejection. Where people are rejected all the time. Precarity is our social condition. Nobody disputes that. But what happens after that state is diagnosed or identified is really the critical point of departure for politics.
Can I just pull on this right fucked and left fucked for a second? Because it's changed my mind about what you were using the category of the fucked for. I can understand from, let's say, a perspective in the US that an awful lot of, right-wing people who are taking to the streets are fucked, or they feel themselves fucked. And part of their response is tear it all down, make nothing possible anymore, or everything possible. On the other hand, the left fucked are those who understand that they've been constituted on the outside or thrown on the outside through really everyday normal practices of hiring and firing and buying and selling. They find themselves without any recourse, and they're like, I can't form a union, I can't protest, I can't vote for a different candidate. I'm fucked. And so I see a difference here, and I wouldn't put it in terms of optimism or pessimism, hope or lack of hope. I would just say that the difference is being fucked and therefore opening the possibility of constructing one's life, or being fucked and therefore destroying the possibility of everyone constructing a meaningful life.
Heads up, listeners, we left Twitter. We packed up, shut the lights off, and logged out permanently. Not because it stopped being fun, but because it stopped being ethical. So if you're looking for us online, don't go lurking in Elon's hellscape anymore. Instead, follow us where the real conversation happens, on Blue Sky. That's where we're sharing our episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and all the half-baked takes we used to share on Twitter. If you love what we do here, don't just sit there. Press pause now and go follow us. You can find us at Hotel Bar Sessions on Blue Sky. No ads, no bots, no billionaire nonsense, just the good stuff. And it is our very strong preference that we keep our conversation with you going on that platform. Of course, you can also find us on Facebook, TikTok, and YouTube, and we appreciate your likes or follows on all of those platforms. Now, back to the conversation.
Is the question then one of nihilism? And by nihilism, I mean a denial of all possibilities and therefore let's explode the world? Or is it a question of what becomes possible when we realize where we are?
Yes.
Well, part of why I'm pushing that, and I know Carlos hasn't talked about this much, but the people that Carlos looks at, the artists, are neurodivergent. People who are in the informal economy. And in some ways, when we're discussing this, that seems very pertinent.
Yeah.
Embodiment is not unimportant, nor is it unimportant that the work is happening in Latin America, which has very different governmental structures than the ones we had in the US. Who knows what we will have. But I feel like it's instructive in that respect that maybe we are going to have to figure out what we do in a very differently configured governmental set of structures.
I think I have an answer to both your and Rick's question. Tongue in cheek, I use the idea of left fucked and right fucked, but at the same, I actually kind of believe that. I think that there are all these historical moments, whether we talk about Stoicism, even I think I could find some places where in the Nicomachean Ethics, it feels like what's happening is a kind of critical acceptance of the violence and inequality of this world. I think that the history of philosophy, even if we look at the City of God and these historical texts trying to come up with these structures, they begin with a sense of, like you said, Devanya, what's possible and what is actual. And I don't think that it has to be utopianism in either direction. I think it could just be the grind or the hustle.
Yeah.
We can go back to the history of literature of work in the 70s. I'm thinking specifically of crime literature in the 70s, like Iceberg Slim. They're talking about an almost insurmountable state of violence, the pimp game, the drug game. There's a whole lot of present in the world of being fucked. There's a whole lot of production that can be done in the world of being fucked. Where our horizons come politically or where they are taken to be serious aspects of our social and historical cultural production, I think depends on each writer's approach. I'm not trying to kick the can down the line, but I'm trying to suggest that we need to test our political categories and our aesthetic categories in order to see that they don't necessarily lead to the kind of ethics and utopianism that we might like. In fact, they can lead to the perverse and hyper-violent for a lot of us, or they can lead to the grind, the hustle, the situation of being fucked. La jodienda. And in Spanish, jodienda has a more ample set of meanings than just being fucked. La jodienda could be the mix. It could be, estoy en una jodienda, I'm in a negative situation. Esta jodienda aquí, this is a situation that's kind of fucked, but somewhat okay and has possibilities. So I think of myself as a scholar of the present, and maybe I'm doing to some degree a diagnosis of the present.
I love what you're doing. And as somebody who currently feels entirely fucked, as I imagine a lot of Americans do, I think that you've put out many threads that people can grab onto here to connect to other really important ideas in the history of philosophy. I think this is important work. I just want to give you a chance to say straightforwardly, if you can, what you think this category does for us. I mean, I don't want to assume that a category always has to do something, but what it is that you think this category might do for us that other categories haven't quite yet done for us.
That's a good question.
Thank you. That's why they pay me the big bucks.
Dun, 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 dun.
Well, from the scholarly perspective, I really did want to talk about material conditions seriously. I'm a Latin American scholar, South America, scholar of Chile, Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. Those are the countries that I feel a great amount of commitment to. I feel a great amount of commitment to the hemisphere more generally. But I think for me, it was important to have a ground home. One of the things that I wanted to do was challenge the way that Goldberg North philosophical and theory categories, theory with this big marketing T that we have, even in certain ways of theorizing Marxist approaches to social life, that there was a lack of focus on development and a lack of focus on precarity and on the material political conditions.
Yeah.
We have a huge informal sector in the United States, but depending on who calculates it, I haven't looked it up in a little while. I try to keep up with it. There are some parts of the hemisphere where 70% of the workers are informal.
Yeah.
Where wage labor in the sense of the daily exchange of cash, and anyway, whether it's virtual or digital, is the center. Millions and millions of people in this hemisphere aren't mediated by the paycheck that comes in the mail and the Social Security. And I felt like we needed to talk about this materiality. I don't think of this category as novel in the sense that we can locate it in Schopenhauer. We can even see, I think, ways of imagining failure or the immobility of our social and individual subjective lives. In Kierkegaard talking about anxiety, you can see it in Nietzsche trying to get to his weird auto-deification, whatever it is that Nietzsche does. And what I think it helps to do is I hope it helps us to focus on the immediacy of our moments. And also I hope that it allows a reader to imagine their situation with some coherence, we are fucked. Let's talk about it.
I wonder if I can remobilize the category of precarity that you've raised many times, because now I'm wondering, is the category of the fucked a kind of maximal level of precarity? We're all living in precarity, sure, but it's not evenly distributed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if the fucked is a certain level of distribution of precarity that doesn't belong to the unfucked or the non-fucked.
It's like a superlative of precarity.
Right.
Yeah. Maybe it's an apotheosis of precarity.
Right.
But I think you're saying something more sophisticated than maybe I've been able to present. And so I'm really grateful for that. One of the things that I should have prefaced this whole conversation with was that in the space of my research, I admit to this being a speculative notion. I'm trying to build a category out of a lot of these things. I'm trying to test this hypothesis of what is formally recognizable as being fucked and how that inaugurates responses.
Right.
Specifically responses from an anti-political, depoliticized refrain, neurodivergent, thinkers like one of the poets I'm looking at, Divino Anticristo, the Divine Antichrist would be a pseudonym, José Onofre Pizarro Cervantes, who was a street poet and celebrity in Santiago. And he talks about his neurodivergence and he talks about what it is to be fucked. And his solution is a kind of ritual magic of the political. Prayers and spells and invocations of this abstract Nazi empire, which is manifested as the total horizon of order, with the anti-Semitism and the destruction and the primordial thread of total annihilation in the space of this kind of fucked apotheosis of what it is to be fucked. We pray to this weird magical cult that we've created. Divino Anticristo says, the way to transmogrify the political is to have El Nuevo Imperio Nazi. And the new Nazi empire is basically made out of praying the rosary, not trusting social media, hating politics, and trying to make these abstracted trains run on time.
Oh, you just totally lost me.
Sounds
there.
like my Aunt Betty.
Wait, back that up. Wait, so the contrary to the Nazi Empire is the Catholic Empire?
More that you can achieve a kind of order and success in life if you recognize how fucked it is and do a set of prayers. It's almost like a hybridizing Napoleon Hill's Think, Grow Rich with the spirituality of the rosary, where you're praying the rosary a certain amount of times for effects, and the conception of this state here as the apotheosis of the Nazi empire, but almost like you got to push Nazism to its next phase. But it's not a Nazism that looks like anything. It's kind of weird. And I don't like using the weird, but it breaks down because part of what I think being fucked is, at least in certain imaginative ways, is trying to find a solution, however incomprehensible and contradictory, to this sense of politics and the social being completely evacuated from any forward momentum anywhere. It just doesn't go anywhere. It's all still the same.
If I could just follow up on the description that you just gave, like one of my deepest, darkest worries and current contemporary worries is that this exactly is the attitude of the fucked. Is that the best we can do is just lean into Nazism. Is just try to make it more efficient and maybe it will break itself. Like that to me is the worst possible strategy.
I think it's a terrifically horrible strategy, a contemptible strategy. That's an absolutely legitimate fear. I hope that I do the work in my research and in my upcoming book to precisely underscore that, but also to show that that's an epiphenomenon of the fucked.
I think you were exactly right diagnostically. I hope you're not right prognostically.
But does this mean there are other possibilities? One could lean into this mystical Nazism. One could do something else too. And it strikes me that at stake in this conversation is how one responds in activity to trauma, maladjustment, and precarity.
Yeah, I completely agree with Devanya. I think that what Carlos was just saying is that we don't actually have to understand the only option of the fucked is accelerationism.
Yeah.
But there might be other options. And,
Absolutely.
For my part, I just want to say, Carlos, I'm looking forward to your book because I'd like to know what those other options are.
I mean, I think one of the options of the fucked is to keep fucking.
But we're on the point of now seeing that the fucked itself is fucked in exactly this way. When I am able to see myself as fucked, there is no definite response to that or even a need to respond at all. And it could be a disastrous Nazi accelerationist response, a Marxist revolutionary response, a response outside of the bounds of sense, or it could be quietude. In that sense, then, the fucked as a subject position, I'm not sure about as an aesthetic category, but the fucked as a subject position is itself fucked.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. My approach to making an aesthetic category, at least one goal that I have, is to suture feeling to what you said, this condition of being fucked. I mean, we could go off in a different conversation here. What does it mean to have an aesthetic category? What are these things? And theory and philosophy often stagger between a bunch of different positions that they might take on this. Yeah, the subject position of being fucked is fucked, but I can write that position. I can transmit that position. I can make it comprehensible through creative means. Even if the emerging moral or hope or takeaway from the reading is that there's nothing left. There's just more of the same. And I mean, of course, this is kind of, I think, unconsciously motivated by theories of the unconscious. Let's take Lacan for a second. We're in méconnaissance. We're a secret to ourselves. We misrecognize ourselves. We misrepresent ourselves all the time. That's a kind of constitutive condition of abjection that no psyche, that no individual is rescued from. Other than acceptance or therapy or the monastic order or being a crook or just being an everyday person and trying to limb these different trajectories between personal liberation and safety for one's family. I mean, I think being fucked speaks to how we sustain ourselves materially. And I think forms how we transmit our creation at the level of aesthetics.
Hey, Hotel Barflies, it's Rick Lee. One of my favorite games, and I think it's one of the most philosophical, is Would You Rather? You know, the game where you're given two choices and you have to choose one. For example, would you like to smell like feet or smell like eggs? Would you rather run on your hands or be able to write with your feet? Well, how about this one? Would you rather keep listening to this podcast for free and feel mildly guilty every time we ask for support? Or pitch in a few bucks and bask in the warm glow of knowing you're a true patron of the pod? Okay, look, if you're choosing option A, that's fine, we'll still love you. But option B? That's the choice of a real barfly, a legend, someone who helps keep this podcast alive. So don't hesitate. Head to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and join the folks making this show possible. Or if you're more of a casual spender, hit up hotelbarpodcast.com and send us a one-time tip. You know what to do. Now, back to the show.
Well, speaking of being fucked, our bartender has just given us last call, and so we've got to wrap up this discussion. I want to thank you so much, Carlos, for joining us. This has been so edifying for me. I mean, I've always thought about the fucked as a subject position as just, if you're fucked, you're fucked, and there's nothing to do. I really do appreciate your opening my mind and my perspective to thinking about the fucked as an aesthetic category that might have more possibilities.
I want to second that.
I cannot thank you enough for joining us today.
Thank you all for just the lovely engagement with my work and the opportunity to speak to you and to learn from you. I think this was just such a collaborative moment. I really enjoyed that. For somebody who studies the fucked, I'm a pretty cheery and optimistic person. So,
can I say finally, as the bartender is flashing the lights on and off to get us the heck out of here, What I like most about this category of the fucked is that it refuses to turn away from the ugly, the messy, and the unthinkable. I feel like that's a good starting point to fight the racist fascists.
And when the lights come on after last call has been called, then I definitely feel like I'm fucked.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'll end with this. Here's something that makes us all fucked. When the bartender says, you don't have to go home,
But you can't stay here.
Where do we go now? We're fucked.
Oh, I love it. All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Good night.